Most scholars date the Gospels to after 70 AD, meaning they would have been written after the destruction of the Jewish temple. This means they were likely written when many of the eyewitnesses had passed away due to persecution or age. But is this accurate? Dating the synoptic Gospels after 70 AD is based on questionable assumptions, and there is actually quite a lot of good evidence to date them prior to 64 AD, when most of the disciples and eyewitnesses were still alive and preaching. The standard view today is Mark was written around 70 AD, Matthew and Luke were written around 85 to 90 AD, and John was written last around 90 to 95 AD. For the purposes of this video, we do not plan to contest the dates for John. Church tradition is that John lived into his old age and composed his gospel close to his death. But what about the synoptics? The main argument for dating Mark to around 70 AD is that Jesus seems to speak of the coming destruction of the temple and Christian persecution. These things took place between 64 and 70 AD, so Mark must have been written after or during this time. Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, so they must have been written after. Fame Perkins says, references to war in Judea, as well as to persecution, suggest that it was written during Nero's persecution of Christians in Rome or the Jewish revolt in Judea. Independently of each other, Matthew and Luke expanded Mark. Barterman agrees and says, it is frequently noted that the earliest Gospels seem to presuppose the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and of the Jewish temple, as happened in 70 CE. For example, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus indicates that the nation of Israel will be destroyed, and that the temple will not be left standing. Matthew is even more explicit. Here Jesus tells a parable in which God is portrayed as burning the city and killing its inhabitants. Luke has similar passages. All these passages seem to presuppose that by the time the books were written, the destruction had happened. So as you can see, one of the main reasons for late dating Mark is that it records that Jesus predicted the temple would be destroyed. Since this happened in 70 AD, Mark must have put these words into the mouth of Jesus to fit with the events happening around him. But this seems to be presupposing the idea that Jesus didn't have the ability to predict the temple's destruction. One is merely imposing a naturalistic assumption onto the text, and then using that to date the synoptics. In other words, since Jesus could not have made such an accurate prediction, Mark must have been written during the event itself. John Nolan says, New Testament critical scholarship has a curious capacity to identify as genuine prophecy that which failed to be fulfilled, and too often to insist that fulfilled prophecy is only after the event description dressed up as prophecy. The possibility of touched-up prophecy is quite real, but to use the dating of Matthew on the assumption that the text could not have spoken so confidently of the coming judgment on Jerusalem and the temple if these had not already taken place represents an uncalled-for imposition. Additionally, this is not really a good reason for dating the Gospel of Mark, because even if Jesus was not divine and could not see the future, there are still good reasons to see his prediction as genuine. In fact, many scholars believe Jesus did predict the destruction of the temple. Stephen Bryan says, it is widely agreed that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple. The scholar Michael Patrick Barber has also put forward numerous arguments that Jesus really did make this prediction during his ministry. First, the idea Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple is a deeply embedded tradition that shows up in multiple passages, including passages that are separate from what we find in Mark. If the tradition was made up during or after the Jewish War, it would have been added to multiple passages that ended up in the canonical Gospels. E.P. Sanders noted the prediction does seem to be a deeply implanted tradition. James D.G. Dunn says, according to the tradition, the key charge brought against Jesus was that he had threatened to destroy the temple. The core of the tradition is clear, as also its diverse elaboration in the different versions, Jesus' talk of destroying the temple. The case for recognizing an historical memory enshrined here is surprisingly strong. Barber also notes it's unlikely Mark would have made this up. Mark reports in chapter 14 that during the crucifixion, many bore witness against Jesus, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.'" Mark and Matthew's handling of their report indicates they're not comfortable with how the saying of Jesus was formulated by Christian opponents. Barber notes this indicates Jesus' prediction may have been misinterpreted in different ways by the people around him. But this seems to indicate the saying of Jesus was contested, and the Christians had to give an account of what Jesus actually said versus what they perceived as twisted versions of this. Dale Allison remarks, "When the tradition struggles this much with a saying, one is prodded to infer that it goes back to something Jesus said, something which, because so well known, generally disallowed, even though Luke managed it, discreet silence." Another aspect of the tradition is in Mark 13, where Jesus said, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Jesus was probably being hyperbolic, as he often was, but scholars have noted this does not correlate with how the temple was destroyed. If one was to invent a prediction of the temple's destruction after the fact, we should expect they would have made it accurate to how the temple and the city were destroyed, not write about it hyperbolically, and allow for the possibility that your audience could have misunderstood and assumed Jesus made an error. Additionally, during the Jewish War, Christians fled to the city of Pella, whereas Jesus advised to flee to the mountains. In the prophecy, Jesus said to pray it does not happen in the winter, but the temple was destroyed in the summer. These details do not make sense if one was writing after the fact. It seems more likely these lines go back to the historical Jesus. As Marcus Borg said, "If Jesus did not prophesy about Jerusalem, then who was the insightful prophet in that generation who was responsible both for this concern and the use of the Hebrew Bible?" Quite probably, the Jesus movement and perhaps the evangelists reworked the language of the threats, but without an initial impulse from Jesus, it is difficult to account for their presence in the primitive tradition. Additionally, predicting the destruction of the temple before it happened was consistent with first-century Jewish thought. A fragmented text from Qumran seems to indicate they thought Jerusalem would be destroyed. In 1 Thessalonians 2, Paul seems to indicate the Jewish authorities would suffer divine judgment for rejecting Jesus. Barber notes the expression Paul uses could easily be understood as prophetic and not having already occurred, and this is likely an allusion to Jesus' prediction, given the similarities in content, meaning we have an indication Jesus' prediction existed prior to 70 AD. Josephus tells us of another figure, Jesus ben Ananias, who also predicted the temple's destruction before it happened, which does have some similarities to Jesus' prediction. Barber does point out there is no evidence of literary dependence. The verbal overlaps between the predictions is limited to legal language. Even more important to this, we can see the book of Daniel predicted the destruction of the temple as well, which Jesus drew on when uttering his prediction. And also his prediction seems to have drawn on the language used to predict the first temple's destruction, and doesn't seem to draw on the events of 70 AD. So if the book of Daniel predicted the temple's destruction, which many Jews of the time saw as authoritative, we should expect someone like Jesus to restate this prophecy. And because of this, there is no reason to assume Jesus' prediction was not authentic. There does seem to be a precedent from before 70 AD to predict the temple's destruction. Additionally, the first temple was destroyed and Israel's sin was said to be the cause. If the temple authorities were perceived as corrupt, it is likely many Jews, including Jesus, would have seen this as a sign the temple would be destroyed again. So given all this, there is no reason to assume the prophecy in the synoptics means that they post-date the destruction of the temple. And additionally, other factors indicate that the synoptics were written before the temple's destruction. In the synoptics and Acts, they often noted if something significant had already passed. The Gospel authors routinely noted how Old Testament passages were fulfilled in Christ. In Acts 11:28, Luke notes a prophecy was uttered about a great famine, but mentioned this happened in the days of Claudius. This means Luke was written after the famine occurred. Likewise, When the Gospels mention Judas, they routinely note he would later betray Jesus, since they are obviously writing after the fact. However, given this standard, it is odd they do not mention the temple was destroyed as Jesus predicted. If they were writing after the temple's destruction, given their style, we should expect them to note when this was fulfilled, especially since this was the most catastrophic of them all. But they don't, and instead the prophecy is written as a warning of something coming in the future. As Jonathan Bernier says, an urgent question nonetheless presents itself to those who argue that these passages were written post-70, with the destruction of the temple in view. Why warn people of an event that has already happened? This can also explain why John, writing later, left out the warning altogether, as he saw no need to give the warning after the event had happened. The synoptics include the warning because the fulfillment had not yet occurred. Similar to this line of reasoning, it is obvious Matthew's Gospel was written for a Jewish audience, with special attention on facts about Jerusalem. Rodney Reeves says, most scholars contend that Matthew's Gospel was written by a Jew for Jews. Special attention to the field Judas hanged himself in would have been irrelevant for a scattered Jewish population after 70 AD. Mentioning the importance of the temple tax after 70 AD would have been problematic, as it would have been going to a pagan temple. In Matthew 5, Jesus gives instructions on how to offer a sacrifice at the temple, information that would have been useless to include in his gospel account if the temple was already destroyed when Matthew was writing. Charles L. Quarles adds that in Matthew 23, Jesus gives instructions for taking an oath before the altar. This information would only be relevant for Matthew's readers if the altar was still in use and the temple still intact. In fact, Quarles points out, in rabbinic literature, we see almost no evidence of oaths sworn by the temple in a post-70 AD time period. To quote, "The oath formulas of Matthew 23:16-22 seem to support a date of composition earlier than the date currently affirmed by the majority of scholars. The oath formulas in the Mishnah, Tosefta, Jerusalem Talmud, and Babylonian Talmud suggest that swearing by the temple was relatively common prior to the destruction of the temple, but very rare thereafter." So what Matthew teaches fits with a pre-70 AD time period. John Wenham says, Matthew's account looks like a vivid record of a terrible clash between Jesus and the religious leaders, rather than a veiled polemic of church against synagogue. Some of the apologetic, e.g. the account of the suicide of Judas and the account of the guards at the tomb, seem of no great theological significance, yet of particular interest to those who frequented Jerusalem. As time progressed, the church movement became predominantly Gentile and less focused on its Jewish roots. Placing the Gospel of Matthew after 70 AD, when Christians were disconnecting from their Jewish roots, seems to be out of place. It makes more sense to place it among the first generation of Christians, and before 70 AD. So various elements in Matthew suggest it aligns with a date prior to the Jewish War, not during or after. Next, an important theme in the synoptics and Acts indicates they were written in a time before Roman persecution. According to both Suetonius and Tacitus, Christians were persecuted under the Roman Emperor Nero, which began in 64 AD. The book of Revelation is critical of Rome, referring to it as a beast while mentioning Christian persecution, which indicates it was written after or during a period of Roman persecution. But in the synoptics and Acts, we see a friendlier attitude towards Roman authority figures. A centurion is said to have more faith than anyone in Israel. Pilate finds no guilt in Jesus and wants to set him free. A Roman soldier rescues Paul from dying at the hands of the Jews, and another treats Paul kindly. Mark said a Roman centurion was one of the few at the cross who understood Jesus was who he claimed to be. Rome is never considered a direct enemy or threat in the Gospels and Acts. The focus is more on the Jewish sects who were opposing the church long before Rome started. Additionally, in John, which was likely written after 70 AD, we see a lack of passages painting Romans in a positive light, which we would expect if the Christians no longer wished to portray Roman authority figures well. The theme throughout the synoptics also indicates they fit with a time prior to 64 AD. Finally, Jonathan Bernier and John A.T. Robinson have pointed out Acts has an enigmatic ending. Several chapters are spent building up for Paul to head to Rome and face trial, where he can present the gospel to Caesar and his court. But Acts ends with Paul arriving in Rome and the statement, he lived there 2 whole years at his own expense. There is no mention of his trial or if he was released. The climactic buildup just ends without a payoff. Paul most likely arrived in Rome in 60 AD. Acts mentions a change in governors of Felix to Festus, which happened that year. Acts records it was Festus that sent Paul for his trial in Rome after he became governor. So if Acts ends with Paul still waiting in Rome for trial, that is probably when Acts was completed and sent off. Otherwise, why would Luke build up to this climactic trial, only to leave his readers guessing if Paul was released or not? This argument made by Bernier and Robinson goes back to Adolf von Harnack, who originally dated Acts to the 90s, but revised his date after considering this point. To quote, "The more clearly we see that the trial of St. Paul, and above all his appeal to Caesar, is the chief subject of the last quarter of Acts, the more hopeless does it appear that we can explain why the narrative breaks off as it does, otherwise than by assuming that the trial had actually not yet reached its close. It is no use to struggle against this conclusion. If St. Luke, in the year 80, 90, or 100, wrote thus, he was not simply a blundering, but an absolute incomprehensible historian." In other words, it makes no sense to document the journey of Paul, foreshadow a trial before Caesar, and not pay it off, and then exclude Paul's release and subsequent death. Despite what others have said, merely arriving in Rome is not a fitting end, since not everything has been answered that was foreshadowed, and it does not result in a climax of Paul bringing the gospel to Rome. Luke notes other Christians already resided there, so Paul merely arriving in Rome results in nothing spectacular. Paul most likely died in the mid-60s. If Acts was written decades later, or even a few years later, it would make no sense to conclude here without detailing the last bits of Paul's life. Thus, given this strange ending, it seems the only reason Acts does not mention the trial is because the trial had not occurred when Acts was finished. Which means the book was roughly completed 62 to 63 AD. But this also means the Gospel of Luke would have been completed prior to this, and since Mark was a source for Luke, that means Mark was also written prior to this as well. The enigmatic ending brings the audience right up to the present time of the author and helps us to see when it was finished. As Jonathan Bernier says, Harnack's argument is not from silence, rather it is an argument from presence, indeed the presence of an extended, 8 chapters, discussion of Paul's legal challenges, and an ending that leaves said challenges unresolved. And Harnack makes a strong case. It is frankly difficult to either disagree with or improve his argument. Either Acts was completed ca 62, when the Acts narrative ends with Paul in Rome, or Luke's aim in these last chapters remains opaque. Now James Crossley notes that some arguments have been put forward to explain the ending of Acts and to preserve the late dating. First, Paul's death might be hinted to in Acts 20:25 in verse 38. There is also no mention of the death of James, which Josephus recorded, so maybe Luke didn't want to record how the apostles died. Luke also doesn't mention the earlier Caligula crisis, so maybe Luke just omitted certain events for unknown reasons. The persecution of Christians in Rome may not have been mentioned because Luke's story simply had not got that far chronologically. Crossley does note none of these arguments are decisive, and if we evaluate them further, we can see they're riddled with problems. First, there is no evidence Luke was intending to write a 3rd volume and continue the story. Bernier says, such arguments are ad hoc, in the worst possible sense. For our purposes, they can be dismissed as little more than speculation. Second, it is a stretch to say Paul's death is hinted to in Acts 20. Paul is merely telling the Ephesians they will not see him again, because he has to go to Jerusalem and will likely face opposition and persecution. Given Paul's experience with persecution from Jewish authorities, this is like entering the lion's den. It is a valid inference for Paul to expect a bad ending and to say a final farewell to the Ephesians. However, Paul does not state that he will die, let alone in Rome. Bernier says, Paul does not state here that he expects to die. Moreover, he states explicitly that he does not know what fate awaits him. Explicit denial of knowing his own fate does not sit easily with the hypothesis that he is predicting said fate. Furthermore, it's logical for Paul to infer he won't be back to Asia Minor, given that he planned to go to Jerusalem, Rome, and then Spain. Given that Paul had big plans to take the gospel elsewhere, it makes sense he did not expect to return to Asia Minor. Also, if Luke was speaking of Paul's death, why not include that in the narrative at the end of Acts? Why only hint to it in the most subtle way, and not include the climactic event at the end to pay off this alleged foreshadowing? The next issue is resolved when we realize that James was most likely martyred in 62 AD, which means it would have happened after Luke finished Acts or was finishing it up, and the news may not have arrived in Rome right away. In fact, this might also point to Acts being written before James was martyred, since that was also left out. Last, the reason Luke doesn't mention the Caligula crisis is because it did not directly affect the mission of the church. Acts is specifically a history of the Acts of the Apostles. Crossley says the Caligula crisis refers to the time the Emperor Caligula attempted to erect his statue in the Jewish temple. This did not directly affect the church or the apostles, so it's irrelevant for the purpose of the book of Acts. Thus, given this, the enigmatic ending still points to the idea that Luke and Acts were completed around 62, and this also suggests Mark had to be completed prior to this. Now, some object and argue we have good reasons to date Acts much later. Steve Mason and Richard Purvo have argued Luke relied on the works of Josephus, which means the earliest Acts could have been written is the late 90s AD. Mason suggests key passages in Acts show signs of borrowed vocabulary that is found within Josephus, and so Acts could not have been written prior. But this is unlikely for several reasons. Carl Armstrong notes similar vocabulary between Acts and Josephus is not enough to suggest literary dependence, as it is also possible they both used a common source. And this is in fact what most scholars believe, when it comes to the similarities between Josephus and Luke. Armstrong also notes that in the passages where Josephus and Acts intersect, they often contradict each other. If Luke was relying on Josephus, this would have been unlikely. Purvo and Mason claim Acts 5:36-37 is dependent on Antiquities Book 20, because both mention the revolt of Theudas, and the argument is Luke followed Josephus' order. But Luke and Josephus date the revolt to different time periods. Luke places it before Herod the Great's death, and Josephus places it in the 40s. I. Howard Marshall and Colin Hemmer note it is plausible that Josephus is the one who misstated the rebellion, or Luke is referring to an earlier rebellion in a different Theudas. There is therefore much to be said for the suggestion either that Josephus got his dating wrong, or more probably, that Gamaliel is referring to another, otherwise unknown Theudas, since there were innumerable uprisings when Herod the Great died, and since Josephus describes 4 men bearing the name of Simon within 40 years. Revolutionary thinking was common in the periods leading up to the Jewish War, so there very well may have been 2 revolts where the leader had the same name. Even if this is wrong and Luke made the error, it is unlikely he was relying on Josephus. Luke and Josephus listed different amounts of followers. Luke says there were about 400, and Josephus says the majority of the masses followed him. If Luke was following Josephus, he would have been more careful to follow what Josephus said, and research does indicate Luke was fairly accurate in following his own sources. Luke's account is also much shorter, and so it is odd for Purvo to suggest Luke copied from Josephus in one place, where he clearly contradicts Josephus on important details. Furthermore, Armstrong notes there are other details that make it unlikely that Luke used Josephus. It seems rather negligent of Luke to avoid the tantalizing detail of Theudas as a certain impostor by Josephus, given his proclivity to denounce sorcery throughout Acts. Surely Luke would not have missed this aspect of Josephus' account of Theudas. Also, if we follow the transcriptional canon, that the more difficult reading is to be preferred, the Acts account is more likely to be earlier, given the possible anachronism of Theudas and Judas. Since the Acts account is unquestionably brief, as compared to Josephus's, the shorter reading is to be preferred. Last, given Luke's interest in rulers and political details in Acts, it seems rather negligent that he would skip over the note when Thaddeus was procurator of Judea. Another place Purvo claims Luke is relying on Josephus is in Acts 21. But Luke's mention of the Egyptian is merely a footnote compared to Josephus's extended account. Given his style, if Luke was copying Josephus, he would surely have included more details. And like with the prior example, both Josephus and Luke differ on the number of followers, and also Luke employs a different preposition. Similar issues can be found in other places, where it is claimed that Luke relied on Josephus. In fact, the scholarly consensus is that Luke and Josephus probably relied on similar sources, rather than one copying the other. As Gary Goldberg said regarding another alleged point of contact, Josephus and Luke may have used similar or identical sources in composing their passages. This explanation appears to be the simplest. Thus, there is no reason to assume Luke was dependent on Josephus, and all the evidence points to Acts being completed by 62. Given this, we can create some tentative dates. Given that Paul's longest letters do not quote the Gospels, and only seem to refer to the Jesus tradition in oral form, the synoptic Gospels and Acts likely came after them. Luke and Acts were likely written between 61 and 63 AD. Since Luke was relying on Mark would have had to come first. One church tradition says Mark wrote the preaching of Peter while they were in Rome. Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome during his reign, so Peter could not have been in Rome from between 49 AD and 54 AD. So we can tentatively date Mark to 57 to 60 AD, which would chronologically fit with Luke arriving shortly after with Paul and him opening his gospel by referring to others who have written accounts. Since the consensus is that Matthew also relied on Mark, but the evidence still suggests Matthew dates prior to the destruction of the temple and the first Roman persecution, we could tentatively date Matthew to the period of 59 to 64 AD. Some suggest Luke was aware of both Mark and Matthew, but we cannot be sure of this. This would also fit with the idea that as many of the disciples were aging, the church would have likely realized the need to have the gospel written down, so it was preserved for future generations. The common practice of a rabbi was to obtain disciples younger than him, so the disciples were likely in their 20s when Jesus was on earth. 30 years later, they would be in their 50s and would be approaching the point when the average male from that time would pass away. So it makes sense this is the time when the gospel accounts were written down so future generations could retain them. Thus, given the evidence, we can infer the Gospels likely date to the late 50s to the early 60s, after Paul's longest letters were completed, but before the Jewish War began. And given this, the church tradition that they came from their attributed authors seems legitimate, since they would not date to later periods when many of the eyewitnesses and disciples would have passed on. The Gospels chronologically fit with the period when the first generation of Christians were still in existence, and when the eyewitnesses were still preaching. This fits with other data points, pointing to their reliability and demonstrating we're not dealing with late legends, but reliable biographies based on well-preserved traditions the church has handed down to us.